Refugees themselves are trying to cope with viral hepatitis, malaria, malnutrition. They've vaccinated certain cholera, have no anti-typhoid vaccines are collected for us to mail. Later we count 4,000. I know you're probably not believing any of this, but it's all true.
The Southeast Asian refugee crisis. Out of a total Southeast Asian population of 56 million in 1975, more than 3 million people would flee repressive regimes and violence. Figures for those who would perish in their search for freedom can only be estimated in the hundreds of thousands. A challenge was called. How would the world community react? For Canada and its people, the challenge was met with a show of trademark kindness and empathy. For its efforts worldwide in resettling refugees, the people of Canada would receive the Nansen Award from the UNHCR, the first time the award was given to an entire nation.
That this honor is not for us an end in itself. It is an incentive for us to develop our sense of sharing so that the homeless and oppressed will see that we strive to live by the word of He who said, "I was a stranger, and you have received me in your homes."
But let's see how the stage was set.
Saigon was now encircled.
Saigon, April 30th, 1975. The city fell in a wave of confusion and hopelessness. The new government turns Vietnam into a police state as the entire country retools itself into a communist regime, politically and economically, and usually by force. The police state persecuted those who served the old regime, specific ethnic and religious groups, and intellectuals able to speak out against their cause. 1 million citizens were processed through what the government called re-education camps, in reality concentration camps for forced labor where hundreds of thousands would die. The new regime forcibly de-urbanized the South, moving people into new economic zones in an effort to blend revolutionaries with puppets, rural with urban, and ethnic groups into border areas with potential rival nations and into sparsely populated highlands. The fall of South Vietnam and withdrawal of major US forces created a power vacuum, and eventually led to general communist victories all over Southeast Asia, including the civil war in Laos. The CIA had trained local guerrilla forces in Laos, most notably the Hmong people, to disrupt North Vietnamese operations, particularly the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. Fresh from their victory in Laos and seeking revenge against the guerrillas, the Pathet Lao police state ordered the extermination to the last root of the Hmong people because of their involvement with the Americans. In an effort to avoid persecution, the Hmong fled to Thailand, avoiding soldiers either on foot through the mountains or floating across the Mekong River. Thousands died during this perilous journey. By the end of 1975, 40,000 Hmong had succeeded in reaching Thailand, and this would continue for many more years as they faced repression at home. 140,000 Hmong and other highland peoples were resettled worldwide from 1975 until 1997. 180,000 ethnic lowland Lao connected to US forces would also be resettled worldwide. Meanwhile, in Cambodia, one of the bloodiest genocides in recorded history was being carried out by the regime in power, the Khmer Rouge. Although North Vietnamese forces and the Khmer Rouge fought alongside each other against Western interests, their marriage of convenience hid a deep paranoia of each other. As the US withdrew, so the Khmer Rouge began to turn its ugly head against ethnic and religious minorities at home. In response to perceived Vietnamese dominance and in the name of purity of populace, both ethnic and religious minorities were purged. Supporters of the former regime, professionals, and intellectuals able to speak out against the Khmer Rouge found themselves in the killing fields, referring to the labor camps turned mass graves where millions of executions were carried out. They were joined by hundreds of thousands of ethnic Vietnamese and Chinese, Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims alike. The Khmer Rouge's policies of forced relocation, mass executions, and forced labor, along with general malnutrition and disease, led to the deaths of a conservative estimate of 1.5 to 3 million people. This number is still debated among scholars, journalists, and officials. The world would bear witness to one of the largest population exoduses in modern history.
To become a refugee is basically to contest, to deny despair. It's an unwillingness to accept that you're over and you're done. People said some really interesting things. They went through how their prosperity had been taken away, how the freedom that they'd had pretty well been eliminated, how they were suspect because they were on the wrong side of the regime. And they'd say, I might have been willing to stick it out for myself. I just couldn't live knowing that my children had no future.
Canada would take on refugees cautiously at first. Between May of 1975 and December of 1976, approximately 6,300 Southeast Asian refugees arrived in Canada. About 2/3 of those were accepted because they had relatives in Canada. The remaining third were convention refugees seeking asylum because of race, religion, or political opinion. Meanwhile, the number of boat people arriving in neighboring countries rises. Processing is slow, and lack of UN coordination is apparent. In spite of this, in 1978, things start to change for Canada. The beginnings of the private refugee sponsorship program are formed by then Minister of Immigration Bud Cullen, and the Immigration Act of 1976 comes into effect, which in short changed how refugees were evaluated and included them as a new immigrant class. The government started looking at who should be allowed into Canada, not who should be kept out.
The refugee sponsorship program and the designated class for Indo-Chinese refugees made the selection of them under the Canadian immigration system much, much easier than it would have otherwise been. My name is Mike Malloy. In 1979, when the big refugee program started, I was asked to become the senior coordinator of a task force that was set up by the Deputy Minister of the then Department of Manpower and Immigration. But my job was to make sure that the different parts of the system overseas and in Canada worked together. In November 1978, there was an event that changed everything. And that was a boat called the Hai Hong.
The Hai Hong was a freighter, packed with roughly 2,500 refugees from Vietnam sitting stranded off the coast of Malaysia, with little food, water, or medical supplies. It was caught in a standoff with the Malaysian government, itself already cracking under the pressure of incoming refugees. While the UNHCR was stalled over what to do, and with Malaysia on the verge of towing the Hai Hong out to open sea, Canada would take the initiative.
And it was our immigration minister, Bud Cullen, who broke with the consensus, at the urging of the government of Quebec, I might add, to do something about it. Then the journalists got on, and the images of how 2,500 people fit in a ship that's less than 200 feet long. Those images came out, and it was really clear that unless something was done, people were going to start to die. And that had a huge impact on the Canadian people.
The images from the Hai Hong galvanized the public to action, and the apex for the movement in Canada occurred in 1979 and 1980. Though Canada had now accepted a little over 9,000 refugees, the rate at which they were arriving in countries of first asylum was still dramatically increasing. It was ever more apparent that unified help from the international community was needed. Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives formed government in May of 1979 and bring two key players, Ron Atkey and Flora MacDonald. At an emergency meeting of the UN in Geneva, spurred on by strong public opinion at home, they would take major leadership roles, announcing that Canada would resettle 50,000 refugees. When the Liberals returned to power in 1980, Immigration Minister Lloyd Axworthy would add another 10,000, bringing the commitment up to 60,000. Though leadership at the top was key, it was under the new private sponsorship program that the warmth and empathy of ordinary Canadians all over the country was focused into action. Groups of 5 private citizens could sponsor a refugee family to Canada, which would then be matched by the Canadian government.
And if they pay the settlement costs, we can probably double the number of refugees we bring in. That was the motivation for it. And so the question was, the UN said, well, this is all very nice, but will ordinary people do this? Now, the interesting thing is it worked amazingly well during that 2 or 3 year period when most people from Southeast Asia arrived. At the local level, you could actually do something. You could sponsor people. And that spread like wildfire.
2 of the most well-known organizing bodies were Operation Lifeline in Toronto and Project 4000 in Ottawa.
When people are drowning in the side of my boat and I have some room in my boat and there's a bit of extra food and room for them, I don't care what the color of his skin is or what the ethnic group is, I have a moral obligation to take him on board.
In Ottawa, then Mayor Marion Dewar met with community leaders to organize Ottawa for incoming refugees. The city would rally to her call of action.
I was at the public meeting that Dewar held in Ottawa, and when I arrived a bit early, and I helped put up the chairs and whatnot. I'm just showing up as like anybody else. We put out 400 chairs, and we had to put out 2,000 chairs, and there were not enough seats. as this was going on, the Mennonite Central Committee, the Mennonite, got in touch with the government and said, we understand there's a new sponsorship program. We'd like to sign an agreement with that. So this was all happening at the end of 1978. By March, they had signed an agreement, and as soon as they signed, a whole bunch of other churches came on board. The word was spreading out through the church networks, the Catholic network, the Anglican network, United, Mennonite, Presbyterian, Lutheran, that there was this new deal where a church or a group of people can actually do something.
This massive response took everyone by surprise, and by the end of 1979, Canadians had overshot the target of 21,000 as private groups filed sponsorships for almost 30,000 refugees. By December 1980, the total sponsored would reach 60,000 refugees. Canada would go on to accept over 200,000 Southeast refugees, the highest number per capita of any resettlement country. None of this would have been possible without the unity of the Canadian people and their willingness to go above and beyond for a stranger, and the extraordinary drive of civil servants who were dedicated to a greater good. But the next chapter in Canada's history of immigration and diversity is only just beginning.
Canada is one of those countries that figured out a fair while ago that differences and diversity are actually a source of strength, not a source of weaknesses. And when you sort of draw people together with a whole bunch of different perspectives, but a similar desire to succeed and create a good future for themselves and their neighbors, there's a lot of good things that happen.
The magic is in the value of our people. Where Ugandan refugees who arrived in 72 were already sponsoring Indo-Chinese refugees in 79. And where Hmong people living in Kitchener-Waterloo last fall were selling spring rolls at the Mennonite churches to raise money for the Syrians. I don't think there'd be any Canadian identity without immigration. But I think we have a great advantage in Canada that our identity as Canadians is plastic. There were always doubts about what the hell Canadians were. I mean, we didn't even have citizenship until 1949. We didn't have a flag until the 60s. It kept our minds open. Because we didn't define clearly what a Canadian was. We end up with an idea that Canadian is about adherence to a set of values rather than belonging to a particular gene pool. And so immigration has everything to do with that. That's what makes us Canadians.